Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Universe Night. Tonight we travel back along the banks of a slow, dark river into a kingdom that measured time in floods and stars, and yet somehow, thousands of years before microscopes or scalpels of steel, understood more about the human body than almost anyone gives it credit for. Tonight's journey is through the medicine of ancient Egypt. You will hear of a physician who became a god. You will hear of a papyrus scroll that first gave the world the very word for brain. You will hear of honey pressed gently into open wounds, of a wooden toe carved for a woman who lived and walked 3,000 years ago, and of a heart so trusted that it alone, of all the body's organs, was left resting quietly inside the chest for eternity. There is so much here that feels startlingly modern, and so much that still belongs entirely to its own strange and sacred world. Let your body settle now. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, soft and heavy. Let your breathing slow, unhurried, like the Nile itself easing toward the sea. Let your grip on today loosen, finger by finger, thought by thought. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Let's begin. Imhotep was a physician who became a god. Long before Egypt built the Great Pyramids of Giza, there lived a man named Imhotep, chief physician and architect to the pharaoh Djoser, in the 27th century before our era. He designed the step pyramid at Saqqara, the first massive stone structure raised by human hands anywhere on Earth. But it was his skill in healing that outlasted even his monuments. Over the centuries that followed, his reputation grew so vast that the Egyptians could no longer imagine him as merely a man. They elevated him to full divinity, a god of medicine and wisdom, and built temples where the sick would travel to sleep, hoping he might visit them in dreams and whisper a cure. Imagine a physician so beloved that grief for his mortality softened, slowly, into worship. Centuries later, the Greeks would recognize him too, folding his identity into their own healing god, Asclepius. It is a rare thing for a healer's kindness to survive not just his patients, but his entire civilization, carried forward into the belief systems of people who never knew his name in the original tongue. The Edwin Smith Papyrus is the oldest known surgical text in the world. Written around 1600 BCE, though likely copied from a document centuries older still, this remarkable scroll contains 48 case studies of injury and trauma, each one structured with startling clarity: examination, diagnosis, and treatment. Unlike so much of ancient medicine, it leans away from magic and spells, describing instead a rational, almost clinical approach to wounds of the head, neck, chest, and spine. Some cases were marked with a chilling honesty that still feels ahead of its time, an unadorned note meaning, essentially, there is nothing to be done. Picture an unnamed physician, thousands of years ago, kneeling beside an injured worker, running through a mental checklist as methodical as any modern emergency room triage. That scroll of papyrus, brittle and amber-colored now, holds within it the seed of an idea that would take millennia to fully bloom, that the body could be understood injury by injury through observation alone. The Ebers Papyrus contains over 700 remedies, dating to roughly 1550 BCE. This is one of the longest and most complete medical documents to survive from the ancient world, a scroll more than 20 meters in length when fully unrolled. It moves from head to toe, cataloging treatments for everything from digestive troubles and skin conditions to parasites, coughs, and even what appears to be an early description of tumors. Some of its remedies feel wonderfully strange to modern ears, involving specific plants, minerals, and animal fats measured with careful precision, while others describe procedures still recognizable in principle today. What makes this so captivating is the sheer scale of ambition behind it, an attempt to write down, in a single unbroken document, nearly everything a physician of that era might need to know. It is a reminder that the impulse to gather knowledge, to preserve it against forgetting, is as old as civilization itself. The Kahun Papyrus is the oldest known medical text in existence, predating even the Edwin Smith and Ebers papyri. This document was written around 1800 BCE and focuses entirely on women's health, including fertility, pregnancy, contraception, and gynecological complaints. It is astonishing to consider that the earliest surviving medical text humanity possesses is not a general treatise, but one dedicated specifically to the female body. Within its lines are prescriptions and diagnostic methods that reveal a society already grappling seriously with reproductive health nearly 4,000 years ago. Some of its suggested treatments blend the practical with the symbolic, plant-based remedies alongside ritual elements, showing a worldview in which body and belief were never fully separate. This is not simply an old document. It is a fragile thread connecting every woman who has ever sought care for her body back to a scribe working by lamplight on the edge of the desert. Ancient Egyptian physicians tested for pregnancy using barley and wheat. According to instructions preserved in medical papyri, a woman would urinate on separate bags of barley and wheat seeds over several days. If the barley sprouted, tradition held that the child would be a boy. If the wheat sprouted, a girl. If neither sprouted, there was thought to be no pregnancy at all. Remarkably, modern researchers have actually tested this method with real urine samples and found that the seeds do respond, at least partially, to the elevated hormone levels present during pregnancy, germinating at a noticeably higher rate than when exposed to urine from men or non-pregnant women. The sex prediction portion has never been validated, but the underlying pregnancy detection shows a strange whisper of accuracy. Picture 2 small cloth bags of grain, damp and green-tipped, sitting quietly in the Egyptian sun, becoming perhaps the first biological pregnancy test devised by any civilization. Some truths take thousands of years to be measured properly, yet were sensed correctly long before anyone understood why. Honey was used as one of the most common wound treatments in ancient Egypt. Physicians applied it directly to cuts, burns, and infections, often mixed with grease and lint to form a kind of primitive dressing. This was not simply superstition. Honey is naturally low in moisture and slightly acidic, which makes it inhospitable to many bacteria, and certain honeys even produce small amounts of hydrogen peroxide as they interact with the wound, giving them genuine antibacterial properties. Modern medicine has, in fact, returned to honey in specialized wound care products for exactly these reasons. Imagine a field surgeon on the outskirts of Thebes, spreading warm honey across a laceration by torchlight, with no understanding of bacteria, yet somehow arriving, through careful observation and generations of trial, at a treatment that still holds value today. Some solutions are so effective that time simply cannot make them obsolete. Moldy bread was pressed into wounds long before anyone understood what mold could do. In certain medical texts, physicians recommended applying bread that had been left to grow mold as a treatment for infected injuries. This practice, echoed elsewhere in the ancient world as well, sits eerily close to the discovery of penicillin more than 3,000 years later, when Alexander Fleming noticed that a stray mold was killing bacteria in his laboratory dish. The ancient Egyptians could not have understood the microscopic war being waged in that greenish crust, yet they observed, again and again, that it seemed to help. That is extraordinary. It suggests a kind of patient, repeated empiricism, a willingness to notice what worked even without a theory to explain why. Somewhere in the gap between instinct and science, an ancient physician pressed a piece of spoiled bread against an open wound, and without knowing it, brushed against one of the most important medical discoveries humanity would ever make. Some ancient Egyptians survived having holes drilled into their skulls. This procedure, known as trepanation, involved cutting or scraping an opening into the cranium, and while it sounds almost unthinkably dangerous, archaeologists have found skulls with clear evidence of bone healing around the edges of these openings, proof that some patients lived for months or years afterward. The reasons for the procedure remain debated. It may have been used to relieve pressure after head trauma, to treat seizures, or for reasons that were partly ritual or spiritual. What is certain is that surviving such an operation, performed with hand tools and no anesthesia beyond whatever plants and rituals were available, required both a skilled operator and a remarkably resilient patient. Not a simple carving, a negotiation between a healer's hands and a patient's will to endure. It is humbling to think that the boundary between life and death in ancient surgery could sometimes come down to a few careful, steady strokes of a blade against bone. A wooden and leather toe, carved for a real woman, may be the oldest functional prosthetic in human history. Known today as the Cairo toe, This artifact was discovered attached to the foot of a mummy and dates to somewhere between 950 and 710 BCE. Unlike purely ceremonial replacements meant only for burial, where patterns on the toe suggest it was used during the woman's actual lifetime, articulated with hinge points that allowed a more natural gait aisle walking in the sandals common at the time. Researchers who studied its design found it remarkably functional, shaped and adjusted with what appears to be genuine anatomical understanding of how the foot bears weight. Picture a craftsman carefully carving and refitting this small wooden toe again and again, adjusting it the way a shoemaker today might adjust a shoe, simply so that one woman could walk a little more easily through her days. Not a symbol, a tool, quietly built out of care. Paseshet may have been the first named female physician in recorded history. Referenced on an inscription from around 2500 BCE, she held the title Lady Overseer of Female Physicians, suggesting not only that she practiced medicine herself, but that she supervised and trained other women in the field. This places organized female medical practice in Egypt among the earliest documented anywhere in the world, at a time when written records of any individual professional woman are exceedingly rare. We know frustratingly little else about her life, her patients, or her specific methods, and yet her single surviving title tells us that an entire structure of trained women healers likely existed around her, largely lost now to time. That possibility is astonishing. Somewhere beneath the sand, there may once have been schools, students, and generations of women passing medical knowledge quietly from hand to hand, their names never carved into anything that survived. Herodotus wrote that Egyptian doctors specialized in only one part of the body. The Greek historian, traveling through Egypt in the 5th century BCE, was struck by how organized and divided Egyptian medicine had become. Some physicians treated only the eyes. Others handled diseases of the teeth, or of the stomach, or conditions considered internal and hidden from view. Rather than a single generalist attending to every ailment, a patient might see several specialists over the course of one illness, each trained deeply in a narrow domain. This structure, remarkable for its age, echoes the way modern medicine has organized itself into departments and specialties nearly 25 centuries later. It suggests a medical culture confident enough in its own body of knowledge to divide it, to say that no single mind could hold it all. Sometimes progress does not look like one great leap forward. It looks like a slow, careful decision to let expertise grow narrower and deeper, one small domain at a time. The Per-Ankh, or House of Life, functioned as something between a temple, a library, and a medical school. Attached to major temple complexes throughout Egypt, these institutions housed scrolls of religious, scientific, and medical knowledge, and served as centers where scribes and physicians were trained. Students would study alongside priests, copying and preserving texts by hand, learning both the practical remedies passed down through generations and the ritual language believed necessary to make treatments effective. It was not a hospital in the modern sense, but rather the quiet intellectual engine behind Egyptian medicine, the place where new physicians were shaped and where knowledge, so easily lost to fire, flood, or forgetting, was deliberately kept alive. Imagine a candlelit room lined with papyrus scrolls, the soft scratch of reed pens copying medical case studies that were already, even then, considered ancient. Civilizations rise and fall, but a well-tended library can outlive them all. Egyptian eye makeup may have doubled as medicine. The distinctive black kohl lining seen in Egyptian art, and worn by both men and women, was typically made from galena or malachite, minerals containing lead compounds. While excessive lead exposure is now known to be harmful, some researchers have proposed that in the small, controlled amounts used cosmetically, these compounds may have offered a degree of antibacterial protection against the eye infections that were common along the dusty, fly-ridden banks of the Nile. The makeup also served a practical purpose beyond any medicinal one, reducing the glare of intense desert sunlight in a manner similar to the black grease modern athletes wear beneath their eyes. Picture an ordinary morning ritual, a small stick dipped in dark pigment and drawn carefully along the eyelid, functioning simultaneously as beauty, protection, and perhaps, unknowingly, as medicine. Not every remedy in history arrived labeled as one. Some hid in plain sight, disguised as ordinary habit. Willow bark, chewed or brewed by ancient healers, contains the same compound that eventually became aspirin. Egyptian medical texts describe using willow and myrtle preparations to ease pain and fever, unaware that the bark contains a natural compound called salicin, closely related to the salicylic acid used in the aspirin sold in every modern pharmacy. It would take until the late 19th century for chemists to isolate and refine this compound into the tablet form, F. Familiar today, yet the underlying relief it offered had already been known in cruder form for thousands of years. This is not simple folk remedy. It is early pharmacology, arrived at not through laboratory analysis but through patient, repeated observation of what eased suffering and what did not. Somewhere in a modern medicine cabinet, in a small white tablet, there lives a distant echo of bark stripped from a tree beside the Nile. Garlic and onions were considered essential to strength and health, even for the laborers who built the pyramids. Ancient records, including notes from the Greek historian Herodotus, describe garlic, onions, and radishes being distributed to the workers constructing the pyramids at Giza, believed to provide strength and protection against illness. Modern science has since confirmed that garlic in particular contains compounds with genuine antimicrobial properties, capable of inhibiting the growth of certain bacteria and fungi. Whether or not the ancient Egyptians understood the mechanism, they had identified, through generations of shared experience, a food that seemed to keep workers healthier during grueling, dangerous labor. Imagine the vast work sites at Giza, thousands of laborers fed on bread, beer, and onions, their daily rations doubling quietly as preventive medicine. Even the humblest kitchen staple, it turns out, can carry within it a kind of hidden science, waiting patiently to be explained. There is evidence that cannabis was used in ancient Egyptian medicine, likely to ease pain and treat eye conditions. Traces of the plant have been identified in some ancient remains and medical references, suggesting it may have been ground into remedies for inflammation, pain, and possibly conditions like glaucoma, an application modern researchers would later investigate for entirely different reasons. Egyptian physicians had no framework for cannabinoids or receptors, only the accumulated memory that certain plants dulled certain kinds of suffering. What makes this so quietly remarkable is how consistent the thread is across thousands of years, one culture after another independently arriving at similar plants for similar relief, guided only by attention and repetition. Not chemistry, not yet. Just the long, unbroken practice of noticing what helps a suffering body and passing that knowledge carefully to the next generation of healers. Opium likely served as one of the ancient world's most effective painkillers and sedatives. Residue analysis of certain Egyptian vessels has suggested the presence of opium poppy extracts, and medical texts describe remedies intended to quiet a crying child or ease significant pain, some of which modern scholars believe may have included opium in their formulation. Its effects, a heavy, dreamlike calm and genuine relief from suffering, would have made it enormously valuable in a world without modern anesthesia. It is easy to imagine such a substance being carefully guarded, mixed in small and specific doses, understood by physicians to be powerful, and even then, in need of caution. Some remedies discovered by the ancient world were so effective that their core chemistry remains central to medicine today, refined but not replaced, still carried in the pharmacy of any modern hospital. Castor oil, still found in some modern medicine cabinets, was used as a laxative in ancient Egypt. Extracted from the seeds of the castor plant, this oil was noted in medical papyri as an effective treatment for constipation, working by irritating the lining of the intestines to encourage movement. It represents one of the clearest, most direct threads connecting ancient Egyptian pharmacology to home remedies still used by some families today. Thousands of years and countless civilizations later, virtually unchanged in purpose or method. There is something quietly moving about a remedy this ordinary surviving so completely intact across the centuries, unaltered not because no one thought to improve it, but because it simply continued to work. Not every advance in medicine needs to be dramatic. Sometimes the oldest, humblest solution is also the most enduring one. Circumcision appears in Egyptian art dating back over 4,000 years, making it one of the earliest documented surgical procedures in human history. A relief carved into the tomb of Ankhemeher at Saqqara, dating to around 2400 BCE, depicts the procedure being performed, accompanied by hieroglyphic text describing the exchange between practitioner and patient. This makes it, remarkably, the oldest visual surgical record known to archaeology, predating nearly every other depiction of medical practice from the ancient world. The scene is calm, almost administrative, suggesting a procedure that was routine rather than extraordinary within its cultural context. It is a strange kind of privilege to look at an image this old and see, so plainly, an operation being performed by steady human hands, thousands of years before the invention of anesthesia, antiseptic, or a single word of modern medical theory. Stone remembers what flesh cannot, and sometimes that memory reaches all the way back to the very beginning of surgery itself. Hesira holds the title of the earliest named dentist in recorded history. Serving during the Third Dynasty, around the 27th century BCE, his tomb inscription identifies him as chief of dentists and physicians, a title suggesting not only his own practice but a formal recognition of dentistry as a distinct medical discipline, even at this early date. Egyptian diets, heavy in bread made from grain ground on stone, were notoriously hard on teeth, worn down over decades by fine grit mixed unavoidably into the flour, leading to abscesses, infections, and significant pain. Someone had to treat that suffering, and Hesira's title tells us that by his time, that someone already had formal standing and a respected position within the medical hierarchy. It is a small phrase carved in stone, and yet it opens a window onto an entire forgotten profession, one whose earliest known practitioner we can, remarkably, still name. Some ancient Egyptian mummies have been found with teeth bound together by fine gold wire. This early form of dental bridge appears to have been used to stabilize loose teeth, possibly following injury, infection, or the natural bone loss that came with age and a gritty, abrasive diet. The wire was wound carefully around adjacent teeth, holding a loose or replacement tooth in place well enough to survive, in some cases, until the person's death and subsequent burial many years later. This is a level of dental craftsmanship that would not be widely matched again for millennia, evidence of a genuine, functioning field of restorative dentistry, rather than mere extraction and suffering. Imagine a patient speaking, chewing, even smiling, supported quietly by a tiny golden thread wound around their teeth by a craftsman's careful hands. Some of the oldest surviving medical interventions are also, unexpectedly, some of the most delicate. Mummification gave Egyptian embalmers an intimate, practical knowledge of human anatomy unmatched by most other ancient cultures. The process of preparing a body for the afterlife required removing internal organs through a careful incision, understanding the placement and structure of the liver, lungs, stomach, and intestines well enough to extract them without excessive damage to the body's outward appearance. Generation after generation, embalmers repeated this work, developing a working familiarity with the inside of the human body that few outside their profession would have ever possessed. This was not curiosity-driven anatomical study in the way we might imagine science today, but rather sacred, repetitive craft, and yet it inevitably built a form of expertise. What makes this so captivating is the quiet overlap between two seemingly separate worlds, religious ritual and empirical anatomy, sitting side by side inside the same embalmer's tent. Sometimes the deepest scientific knowledge grows not from a desire to understand, but from devotion to something else entirely. The organs removed during mummification were preserved separately in canopic jars, each one protected by a different guardian deity. The liver was watched over by Imseti, the lungs by Hapi, the stomach by Duamudef, and the intestines by Kebe-Senuf, together known as the four sons of Horus. Each organ was carefully dried using natron salt, wrapped, and placed in its own jar, ensuring that the person would remain complete in the afterlife despite the physical process of embalming. This system reveals a society that had cataloged the internal body with genuine precision, assigning distinct treatment to distinct organs based on real anatomical understanding, all filtered through a deeply spiritual framework. Picture 4 small jars, lids carved into the shapes of a man, a baboon, a jackal, and a falcon, standing quiet guard in the darkness of a tomb for thousands of years. Even the practical business of preserving flesh, it turns out, can be woven entirely through with reverence. The ancient Egyptians believed the heart, not the brain, was the seat of thought, memory, and emotion. During mummification, the heart was almost always left inside the body, considered too important to remove, since it would be weighed against the feather of the goddess Mot in the afterlife to determine the person's fate. The brain, by contrast, was regarded as far less significant, its true function entirely misunderstood. This belief shaped Egyptian medicine in a very real way, focusing anatomical attention and reverence on an organ we now know performs a different role than the one they imagined for it. It is a striking reminder that even careful, skilled observers can build an entire worldview around a mistaken assumption, one that nonetheless still produced genuine advances elsewhere. Not Ev. Uri ancient belief survives contact with modern science, and yet even the wrong ones can be beautiful, revealing to us how deeply people once tried to locate the seat of the self within their own bodies. During mummification, the brain was typically removed and discarded, considered unnecessary for the afterlife. Embalmers accomplished this through a remarkable and unsettling technique, inserting a long hooked instrument through the nostril, breaking through the thin bone at the base of the skull, and carefully drawing the brain tissue out in pieces. Unlike the heart, lungs, liver, and intestines, the brain was not preserved in a canopic jar, but simply discarded, considered irrelevant to a person's identity or intelligence. This procedure required real anatomical skill, a working knowledge of the skull's structure precise enough to reach the brain through such a narrow passage without visibly damaging the face. Not gentle, not reverent, in the way other organs were treated. And yet the technical precision involved reveals embalmers who understood the human skull with startling intimacy, even while completely misunderstanding what the organ inside of it actually did. In ancient Egypt, magic and medicine were never fully separate practices. A physician might prescribe a plant-based remedy for an infected wound, and in the very same treatment, recite a specific spell believed necessary to make the remedy effective. This was not viewed as contradictory or unscientific by the standards of the time. Illness was understood to have both a physical cause and often a spiritual or supernatural one, meaning a truly effective treatment needed to address both dimensions at once. A wound might be caused by a blade, but its failure to heal might be blamed on a malevolent spirit, requiring incantation alongside bandage. This is not simple superstition layered clumsily onto real medicine. It is a fully integrated worldview, internally consistent on its own terms, where the visible and invisible causes of suffering were treated as equally real. Sometimes what looks like two separate systems from a great distance was, up close, simply one complete way of understanding a frightening and uncertain world. Heka was the ancient Egyptian concept of magic, and it was believed to be a genuine, measurable force present since the creation of the world. Far more than mere trickery or performance, Heka was considered a fundamental power that gods, priests, and physicians alike could learn to direct, particularly in the service of healing. Spoken correctly, with the right words and the right intention, Heka was believed capable of activating the properties of a medicinal plant or protecting a patient from harmful forces during a vulnerable recovery. Physicians in training would have studied not only botanical remedies, but the precise ritual language required to properly wield them. It is worth pausing on how seriously this was taken, not as decoration around medicine, but as one of its essential working parts. Even now, belief and expectation are recognized to shape how a patient experiences treatment. A strange, distant echo of a concept the Egyptians had already named and structured thousands of years before psychology gave it any name of its own. Sekhmet, the lioness-headed goddess, ruled over both plague and its cure. Worshippers believed she could unleash devastating illness upon Egypt when angered, yet also held the singular power to heal the very sicknesses she caused. Her priests, sometimes called the Wabau of Sekhmet, functioned as a specialized class of physicians, believed to hold particular skill in treating epidemic disease and severe wounds, especially those associated with warfare. This dual nature, a single deity embodying both the wound and the cure, reflects a worldview comfortable with contradiction, where destruction and healing were understood not as opposites, but as two faces of the very same force. Picture a lioness carved in dark stone, worshipped in equal measure with fear and hope by people who understood illness as something almost alive, something that had to be bargained with as much as treated. Not every ancient god offered comfort without complexity. Sekhmet offered both danger and mercy in the very same breath. Serket, the scorpion goddess, watched specifically over those who suffered from venomous bites and stings. In a landscape where scorpions and venomous snakes posed a very real daily danger, particularly to laborers, farmers, and desert travelers, her priests developed genuine specialized knowledge in treating envenomation, likely including practical remedies alongside ritual invocation of her protection. This represents an early example of medical specialization built directly around environmental risk, an entire branch of healing organized around a single, specific category of injury common to the region. It suggests careful, repeated observation of symptoms and treatments across countless cases. Of sting and bite, refined generation after generation into something approaching genuine expertise. Even now, envenomation remains a serious medical emergency, requiring specific knowledge and swift response. Long before antivenom existed in any laboratory, there were already healers along the Nile who had made this narrow, dangerous problem their life's careful study. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, was believed to be the original author of Egypt's medical knowledge. According to tradition, it was Thoth who first recorded the sacred texts of healing, granting humanity access to remedies, incantations, and anatomical understanding that physicians would study and copy for thousands of years afterward. This attribution mattered deeply. By tracing medical knowledge back to a god of writing and wisdom, the Egyptians framed their medicine not as accumulated human trial and error, but as a gift, something discovered rather than invented, requiring careful preservation rather than casual alteration. It helps explain why so many medical texts were copied so faithfully across centuries, treated less like evolving science and more like scripture. There is something quietly moving in the idea that a civilization would choose to credit its hard-won, painstakingly gathered medical wisdom not to itself, but to the very concept of wisdom made divine. Some knowledge, once gained, felt too important to have come from ordinary human hands alone. A carved relief at the temple of Kam Ambo appears to show an entire tray of ancient surgical instruments. Dating from the Greco-Roman period of Egyptian history, this stone carving depicts objects that closely resemble scalpels, forceps, scales, and other tools that would look, in silhouette at least, almost at home in a modern surgical kit. Scholars continue to debate the exact purpose and dating of certain elements of the scene, but the resemblance to genuine medical instrumentation is difficult to dismiss entirely. It suggests a long, gradual refinement of surgical tools across Egyptian history, metal replacing stone, precision replacing improvisation, one careful redesign at a time, largely invisible to us now except in fragments like this one. Picture a temple wall, worn smooth by thousands of years of desert wind, still faintly holding the outline of instruments once gripped by careful, steady hands. Stone can preserve a memory that flesh and iron cannot, quietly outlasting the very tools it depicts. Physicians in ancient Egypt used wooden splints padded with linen to set broken bones. Archaeologists have discovered mummified remains with fractures clearly stabilized in this manner, the splint bound firmly enough to hold the bone in place while it healed, yet padded carefully enough to avoid causing further injury to the surrounding tissue. In several cases, the healed bone shows proper alignment, suggesting the technique worked as intended far more often than we might assume for medicine this ancient. This required not only splinting skill but real anatomical judgment, an understanding of how a limb needed to be positioned to heal correctly rather than crookedly. It is easy to imagine such treatment as crude, and yet the evidence tells a different story, one of genuine competence quietly practiced along the riverbanks. A broken bone, set well enough by ancient hands to still show its proper healing thousands of years later, is its own small, patient kind of miracle. Some ancient Egyptians survived surgical amputations, their bones showing clear evidence of healing afterward. Skeletal remains have been found with limbs removed and the surrounding bones smoothly remodeled, a biological process that can only occur if the patient lived for a significant period following the operation. This tells us something remarkable about ancient Egyptian surgical care. That infection was managed well enough, that blood loss was controlled well enough, and that recovery conditions were adequate enough for the body to be given the chance to heal at all. Without anesthesia in the modern sense, without sterile technique as we understand it today, some patient somewhere endured an amputation and walked away from it, living on for months or years afterward. Not a guaranteed death sentence, as we might assume for such an ancient procedure. A survivable, if agonizing, medical event. It is a quiet testament to both the skill of the surgeon and the extraordinary resilience of the human body itself. The ancient Egyptian word for physician was SWNW, a title entirely distinct from priest or magician healers. While ritual specialists called Wab priests and magical practitioners called Sao also treated the sick, the SWNW represented something closer to what we might now call a formally trained medical doctor, working through observation, remedy, and accumulated practical knowledge. This distinction matters. It shows that Egyptian society, even while comfortable blending magic and medicine within a single treatment, still recognized different categories of practitioner, different types of expertise, worthy of different names. A patient with a stubborn wound might see a SWNW for the physical treatment and a SAO for protection against unseen causes, each role understood as valuable but separate. Even in a deeply spiritual society, there was room carved out specifically for the physician as a distinct kind of professional. Some roles are so essential to a civilization that they earn their own word, carried carefully across thousands of years of language. Eye disease was extraordinarily common in ancient Egypt, and physicians developed an entire body of specialized treatments in response. The combination of intense desert sunlight, blowing sand, and swarms of flies drawn to the moisture around the eyes created ideal conditions for infection and irritation, making ophthalmology one of the most urgently needed medical specialties of the era. Remedies recorded in surviving papyri include mineral-based preparations, plant extracts, and careful cleaning routines, some of which modern researchers have found to possess genuine antimicrobial properties. Given how essential clear vision would have been for nearly every profession, from farming to scribing to temple work, the pressure to develop effective eye treatments must have been immense and constant. Imagine a bright, dusty afternoon along the Nile, wind lifting fine grit into the air, and a physician carefully mixing a remedy meant to soothe eyes irritated by the very land that gave the civilization its life. Even paradise, it turns out, came with its own quiet, persistent hazards. Frankincense and myrrh were burned not only for religious ceremony, but as part of everyday medical and hygienic practice. These fragrant resins, harvested from trees native to distant lands and traded across enormous distances to reach Egypt, were valued for far more than their scent. Physicians and priests alike used them in fumigation, believing the smoke could purify a sick room, and modern chemical analysis has shown that both resins do contain compounds with genuine antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. Their value was so immense that entire trade expeditions, such as the famous voyage to the land of Punt commissioned by Queen Hatshepsut, were organized specifically to secure a steady supply. Picture thick, fragrant smoke curling slowly through a chamber where someone lay ill, the air itself treated as part of the cure, sacred and practical all at once. Some remedies traveled thousands of miles by ship and caravan, just to reach the person who needed them most, carried the entire distance for the simple, universal hope of easing suffering. Egyptian physicians recognized a kind of internal poison they called wakidu, believed to build up in the body and cause illness from within. This concept, appearing throughout medical papyri, described a putrefying substance thought to originate largely in the digestive system, capable of spreading through the body and producing fever, pain, and disease if not properly expelled. Treatment often centered on purgation, encouraging the bowels, inducing vomiting, or administering enemas, all aimed at physically removing this harmful substance before it could do further damage. It is a strikingly early example of a toxin-based theory of illness, one that, while not aligned with modern germ theory, still reflects a genuine attempt to explain sickness through an internal physical process, rather than through unseen spirits alone. There was even a specialized title, sometimes translated loosely as guardian of the anus, given to physicians who focused specifically on this branch of internal medicine. Long before anyone could see a single bacterium, Ancient healers had already built an entire working theory of the poison hidden quietly inside the body. Ancient Egyptian physicians believed the body was threaded through with channels called medu, carrying blood, air, water, and even waste to every part of the body. According to this framework, all of these channels converged at a single central point, the heart, which was understood as the hub from which everything flowed outward, and to which everything eventually returned. Illness, in this view, often meant a blockage or imbalance somewhere along one of these channels, not unlike a canal silting up along the Nile and needing to be cleared before the water, and the land depending on it, could thrive again. It is a striking conceptual leap, an early, imperfect sketch of what we would now recognize as the circulatory system, arrived at without dissection in the modern sense, purely through careful reasoning about the body's behavior in health and in sickness. Picture a physician pressing gentle fingers to a patient's wrist, quietly ruled by a mental map that has more in common with modern anatomy than either of them could have known. Some of the oldest ideas about the body were not wrong so much as unished, waiting patiently for centuries of future hands to complete them. Egyptian physicians paid close attention to the pulse, recognizing it as a signal carried through the very vessels connected to the heart. Medical texts describe the practice of feeling the pulse at multiple points on the body, treating its rhythm and strength as meaningful information about a patient's condition. This places ancient Egypt among the earliest cultures to record pulse examination as a genuine diagnostic tool, a practice that would later be refined further in Greek and eventually in Chinese and Islamic medical traditions. It suggests physicians who understood, at least intuitively, that the heart's activity could be sensed and interpreted from a distance, through nothing more than a careful hand and patient attention. There is something quietly intimate about this image, a healer's fingers resting against a wrist, listening to a rhythm neither of them could see, trusting only touch. Long before instruments could measure it, the human pulse was already being read as a kind of quiet language, spoken silently beneath the skin. Even the Book of the Dead, a text devoted to guiding the soul through the afterlife, contains spells intended to protect and heal the body. Alongside its famous passages describing judgment and the weighing of the heart, the collection includes incantations meant to ward off specific ailments, protect vital organs, and ensure the body remained whole and functional for eternity. This blurring of medical and religious purpose was entirely natural within the Egyptian worldview, where the health of the body in life and its preservation in death were treated as points on the very same continuum. A spell meant to protect the heart in the underworld was not so different, in spirit, from a remedy meant to protect it in daily life. It is a gentle reminder that ancient medicine was rarely only about survival in the present moment. It reached forward deliberately into whatever came after, treating the body as something worth protecting far beyond a single lifetime. Ancient Egyptian medical texts reveal a genuine, practical awareness of diet and its effect on health. Certain foods were recommended for specific ailments, while others were noted as best avoided under particular conditions, suggesting physicians had observed real patterns between what a person ate and how their body responded over time. Bread, beer, vegetables, and fish formed the backbone of the ordinary diet, and adjustments to this baseline appear throughout medical papyri as part of broader treatment plans. This was not a formal science of nutrition as we understand it today, but it reflects the same underlying instinct, the recognition that the body is shaped continuously by what it consumes. What makes this so quietly relatable is how familiar it feels across the distance of thousands of years. A physician adjusting a patient's meals in hope of easing their suffering, exactly as a doctor might still suggest today. Cleanliness held deep importance in ancient Egyptian daily life, closely tied to both religious purity and practical health. Priests in particular were expected to wash multiple times a day and to shave their entire bodies regularly, practices originally rooted in ritual purity, but which likely also reduced the presence of lice, parasites, and skin infection. Ordinary Egyptians, too, placed unusually high value on bathing and grooming compared to many other ancient societies, aided by the reliable presence of the Nile itself. While the underlying reasoning was spiritual rather than microbial, the practical effect would have genuinely supported better health outcomes across the population. It is a lovely kind of accidental wisdom, a civilization achieving something like early public hygiene not because it understood germs, but because it deeply valued being clean before its gods. Beer served as more than a beverage in ancient Egypt. It was frequently used as the base into which medicinal herbs were mixed. Rather than swallowing dried plants or minerals alone, patients were often instructed to consume their remedy dissolved or steeped in beer, making the treatment easier to take and possibly aiding the delivery of certain compounds into the body. Beer itself was a dietary staple, safer in many cases than untreated water, and its mild fermentation may have offered its own small protective benefit. Combining medicine with something already trusted and enjoyed shows a practical understanding of patient compliance, long before that phrase existed in any medical vocabulary. Imagine a tired laborer handed a cup of beer by a physician, unaware that folded quietly within it is the very remedy meant to ease his pain. Sometimes the easiest way to help the body is to hide the medicine inside something it already welcomes. Ancient Egypt produced what may be the earliest known veterinary medical text, addressing the treatment of animals such as cattle and dogs. Found alongside the Kahun gynecological papyrus, this fragment describes ailments and remedies intended for livestock, reflecting how deeply animals were woven into the economic and daily life of the civilization. Healthy cattle meant successful farming, reliable labor, and a stable food supply, making veterinary knowledge every bit as practically important as human medicine for a society built around agriculture. The existence of a dedicated text on animal treatment tells us that this knowledge was considered valuable enough to record and preserve formally, rather than passed along only through informal experience. It is easy to overlook how far back our concern for animal welfare truly extends. Even 4,000 years ago, someone thought a sick ox deserved careful, documented attention. Ear and hearing complaints appear among the many conditions addressed in Egyptian medical papyri. Remedies describe treatments meant to ease pain, discharge, and hearing difficulty, often combining plant-based ingredients with specific application instructions, sometimes involving oils dripped gently into the ear canal. Given the dust, wind, and insects common throughout the region, ear infections and irritation were likely a frequent complaint, much as eye ailments were, and physicians appear to have developed a working repertoire of responses. While the underlying causes of hearing loss were not understood in the way modern medicine understands them, the attentiveness to a sense so easily taken for granted reveals a medical culture unwilling to dismiss any form of suffering as untreatable. Picture a physician tilting a patient's head gently to one side, testing a remedy meant to ease a pain most of us rarely think to imagine in the ancient world. Even the quietest of senses, hearing, was worth this much careful attention. The Ebers Papyrus contains what many scholars consider the earliest written description of symptoms resembling diabetes. The text describes a condition involving the passing of unusually large amounts of urine, a symptom now recognized as one of the hallmark signs of diabetes mellitus. Without any understanding of blood sugar, insulin, or the pancreas, ancient physicians could only observe and record the external symptom, unable to explain its cause or offer anything resembling an effective treatment. And yet the very act of noticing, of writing down a pattern significant enough to include in a major medical text, represents real clinical observation, patiently gathered across countless patients over generations. It would take more than 3,000 years for medicine to finally understand what those ancient scribes had only been able to describe from the outside. Sometimes recognizing a mystery and simply refusing to look away from it is itself the first quiet step toward eventually solving it. The Edwin Smith Papyrus contains an unflinchingly honest description of a breast tumor, along with the blunt acknowledgement that no treatment exists. Among its case studies is a passage describing bulging masses on the breast, cool to the touch and spreading, for which the physician's own prognosis notes plainly that there is no treatment. This is a startling thing to find in a document this old, not an attempt to overpromise a cure through ritual or remedy, but a clear-eyed, almost clinical acceptance of a disease's limits. It suggests physicians capable of real diagnostic honesty, willing to record failure and uncertainty alongside their many successes. There is something deeply human in this admission, an ancient healer choosing truth over false comfort, even when the truth offered nothing but sorrow. Not every entry in the history of medicine is a triumph. Some are simply honest, and that honesty is its own kind of quiet courage. Linen bandages, the very same material used to wrap mummies, were also a central part of everyday Egyptian wound care. Strips of linen, sometimes soaked in honey, plant extracts, or other preparations, were wound around injuries to protect them, absorb fluid, and in some cases actively fight infection. Egypt's advanced linen production, driven originally by its enormous funerary industry, meant that high-quality fabric was widely available for medical use as well, a fortunate overlap between two seemingly unrelated crafts. This same material, so strongly associated in the modern imagination with death and preservation, was in daily life simply practical, reliable cloth wrapped around the living to help them heal. It is a small, quiet irony worth sitting with, that the fabric most associated with Egyptian death was, for most Egyptians most of the time, simply a tool for staying alive. Natron, the mineral salt most famous for drying mummies during embalming, also served as an early cleaning agent in daily life. This naturally occurring mixture of sodium compounds, harvested from dry lake beds in the Egyptian desert, was used not only to desiccate the body during the 70-day mummification process, but also in everyday hygiene, purification rituals, and even in the production of certain remedies. Its drying and mildly antiseptic properties made it useful far beyond the embalmer's tent, appearing in contexts that had nothing to do with death at all. A single substance, harvested from the same desert basins, quietly served both the world of the living and the world prepared for the dead. It is a fitting symbol in its own way, for a civilization that so rarely drew a hard line between the two. Egyptian medicine operated under a surprisingly formal professional hierarchy, complete with titles, oversight, and specialization. Beyond the ordinary SW&W, there existed chief physicians, inspectors of physicians, and overseers who held authority over regional medical practice, some serving specifically within the royal court or military. This structure suggests a level of institutional organization around healthcare that would not be widely matched again for a very long time afterward, with clear lines of training, responsibility, and advancement built into the profession itself. A physician was not simply a person who knew remedies. They were part of a recognized system, accountable to superiors and bound by established practice. It is easy to imagine ancient healing as loose and informal, yet the titles alone tell a different story, one of careful structure quietly holding an entire medical profession together across generations. Illness that resisted ordinary explanation was sometimes attributed to a class of hostile, invisible beings called Aku. These spirits were believed capable of entering the body and causing disease from within, particularly in cases where no obvious physical cause could be identified, such as sudden fever or unexplained pain. Treatment for such conditions, often combined practical remedies with specific protective spells, intended to drive the intruding spirit out or shield the patient from further harm. This was not seen as separate from real medicine, but as an essential extension of it, addressing a category of illness that fell entirely outside the physician's more mechanical toolkit. It offers a glimpse into how ancient people made sense of the frightening unpredictability of disease, giving shape and a name to something that otherwise felt entirely beyond their control. Even now, illness without a clear cause unsettles us in a way that little else does. The mandrake plant, prized for its curious human-like root, was used in ancient Egypt for pain relief and matters of fertility. Its image appears in Egyptian art, sometimes held by figures in romantic or celebratory scenes, suggesting an association with desire and conception, alongside its more directly medicinal uses. The plant does contain genuinely active compounds capable of producing sedative and pain-relieving effects, meaning its reputation was not built on imagination alone. Across many ancient cultures spanning the Mediterranean and Near East, the mandrake carried similar symbolic weight, its strange, forked root often resembling a small human figure, deepening its mystique. Picture a root pulled carefully from the earth, its shape unsettlingly familiar, carried into a physician's hands and believed capable of touching both body and desire alike. Few plants have managed to hold such a firm grip on the human imagination for so many thousands of years. Aloe vera, still found today in countless modern skin products, was used by ancient Egyptians to treat burns, wounds, and skin irritation. Egyptian texts and artifacts suggest the plant held genuine cosmetic and medicinal value. Its cooling, moisture-rich gel applied directly to irritated or damaged skin, much as it still is now. Modern research has confirmed that aloe does possess real anti-inflammatory and wound-healing properties, lending scientific credibility to a practice that Egyptian healers arrived at purely through observation and repetition. There is a rare and quiet satisfaction in tracing a product found in nearly any modern pharmacy back across thousands of unbroken years to the exact same plant, used for remarkably similar reasons. Some remedies never really needed improving. They only needed to be rediscovered, again and again, by each new generation convinced it had found something new. Egyptian physicians performed excision procedures to remove cysts, abscesses, and other troublesome growths from the body. Using sharp blades, often made of obsidian or bronze, healers would open and drain infected swellings, aiming to relieve pressure and pain while allowing the body's own healing processes to take over afterward. This represents genuine minor surgery, requiring not only a steady hand but real judgment about when intervention was necessary and when it might do more harm than good. Evidence from mummified remains occasionally shows healed scarring consistent with these procedures, suggesting patients frequently survived and recovered well afterward. It is easy to imagine such an operation as crude, and yet the underlying logic, relieving pressure, allowing drainage, supporting recovery, remains essentially unchanged in modern surgical practice. Some solutions to the body's suffering were simple enough that they never really needed reinventing. Small clay bricks discovered at the ancient site of Abydos appear to have played a role in the physical act of childbirth itself. Known as birth bricks, these objects were likely used to elevate and support a woman during labor, allowing her to give birth in a squatting position, believed to make delivery easier and safer. One remarkable example, uncovered by archaeologists, is painted with vivid scenes showing a mother, her newborn and protective figures gathered around her, offering a rare, intimate glimpse into how birth was actually experienced and supported in ancient Egyptian households. This was not solely a spiritual object. It served a genuine physical function, quite literally supporting the mother's body during one of the most dangerous moments of ancient life. Picture the weight of a laboring woman pressing down onto sun-baked clay, painted with images meant to comfort her, holding her up in both a physical and a deeply symbolic sense at once. Two protective deities, Bes and Taweret, were invoked specifically to guard mothers and infants through the dangers of childbirth. Bes, a dwarf god with a fierce, almost comic lion-like face, was believed to frighten away malevolent spirits with his loud, protective presence, while Taweret, depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright, represented fertility, protection, and the ferocity a mother might need to defend her child. Amulets and household objects bearing their images were common in Egyptian homes, particularly in spaces associated with birth and early infancy, a period recognized even then as extraordinarily perilous for both mother and child. Their exaggerated, almost startling appearances were deliberate, meant to be more frightening to evil forces than comforting to human eyes. It is a tender thing to consider, an entire household filling itself with strange, fierce little protective figures, simply because the people living there loved someone fragile enough to need that much defending. Modern CT scans of Egyptian mummies have revealed clear evidence of atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of the arteries. Researchers scanning mummified remains from various periods of Egyptian history have identified calcified plaque buildup within blood vessels, a condition today strongly associated with modern diets high in fat and sedentary lifestyles. Finding it so clearly present in ancient Egyptians, some of whom held physically active lives, has challenged the assumption that heart disease is purely a product of modern living. It suggests that genetics, inflammation, and factors beyond diet alone may play a larger role in cardiovascular disease than previously believed, a discovery made possible only by turning modern imaging technology on bodies thousands of years old. There is something quietly humbling in this, a disease we often blame entirely on modern excess, found quietly waiting inside hearts that stopped beating long before the modern world existed at all. Traces of schistosomiasis, a parasitic infection linked to freshwater exposure, have been identified in the tissue of ancient Egyptian mummies. The parasite responsible for this disease thrives in freshwater snails found throughout the Nile and its irrigation canals, meaning farmers, fishermen, and anyone regularly wading through the river's waters faced real, ongoing exposure. Symptoms include chronic fatigue, abdominal pain, and in severe cases, damage to internal organs over time, making it a serious and likely widespread burden on the ancient population. Its presence in preserved tissue confirms that this was not a modern affliction alone, but one that had already shaped health and daily suffering along the Nile for thousands of years. It is a striking reminder that the very river responsible for Egypt's abundance, its floods, its fields, its entire civilization, also quietly carried within it one of its oldest and most persistent hidden dangers. Arthritis and severe dental wear were remarkably common afflictions among ancient Egyptians, largely as an unintended consequence of their diet. Bread, a dietary staple ground using stone querns, frequently contained fine particles of sand and grit worn away from the grinding stones themselves, and decades of chewing this gritty bread wore teeth down dramatically, often exposing sensitive inner layers and leading to painful abscesses. Combined with physically demanding labor across a lifetime, joint degeneration and arthritis were also extremely widespread, visible clearly in skeletal remains recovered from across the region. This was not a rare misfortune, but an almost universal experience, a quiet accumula. Ting cost embedded in something as basic and essential as daily bread. It is a gentle, sobering thought that the very food sustaining an entire civilization was also, slowly and invisibly, wearing away at the bodies of everyone who depended on it. The Berlin Papyrus offers its own separate method for detecting pregnancy, distinct from the barley and wheat test recorded elsewhere. This text describes alternative diagnostic approaches, including observations of physical changes in the body believed to indicate pregnancy, reflecting a broader ancient effort to develop reliable ways of confirming what, at the time, could not be known with any certainty. The existence of multiple, independently recorded pregnancy tests across different papyri suggests this was an area of significant ongoing medical interest, refined and reconsidered across generations, rather than settled once and left untouched. Confirming pregnancy mattered enormously in a society deeply concerned with fertility, inheritance, and family continuity, giving physicians real incentive to keep searching for better methods. Even now, certainty about the earliest days of a new life remains difficult to achieve. Ancient Egypt, it seems, was already trying every reasonable tool available to it. The Herbal Papyrus preserves a further collection of medical remedies that closely overlaps with yet also meaningfully differs from the Ebers Papyrus, believed to have been used by a working physician rather than kept purely as a reference archive. This document offers valuable insight into which remedies were actually applied in daily practice, as opposed to which were simply recorded for posterity. Its condition and specific selection of treatments suggest it may have been a personal or practical working copy, perhaps carried and consulted directly at a patient's bedside. Comparing it against other surviving medical papyri allows scholars to trace how certain remedies persisted, changed, or fell out of use over time. It is a quietly moving thought that somewhere in this scroll's careful selection of treatments, we might be looking at the actual working knowledge of one real physician, choosing which remedies mattered enough to keep close at hand. The London Medical Papyrus stands out for blending straightforward medical remedies with an unusually high proportion of magical incantations. Its content ranges across a wide variety of ailments, but a significant portion leans heavily on spoken spells and ritual gestures alongside, or sometimes entirely in place of, physical remedies. This makes it a particularly clear window into the more overtly magical end of Egyptian medical practice, a useful counterbalance to more clinically minded texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Rather than viewing this as primitive or lesser medicine, historians increasingly understand it as evidence of medicine's full range within Egyptian society, from the rigorously observational to the deeply ritualistic, often practiced by the very same healers depending on the nature of the illness in front of them. Not every ancient physician reached first for a blade or a bandage. Sometimes the first tool taken up was simply the right words, spoken with total conviction. Among the many ailments addressed in Egyptian medical texts, the headache receives its own dedicated attention in the Chester Beatty Papyrus. This document offers a range of remedies aimed specifically at relieving head pain, including herbal preparations, and, in keeping with broader Egyptian practice, accompanying incantations meant to address any underlying spiritual cause. The specificity of an entire section devoted to something as common and universally human as a headache is oddly touching, a reminder that even amid grand temples and eternal monuments, ordinary daily suffering still received careful, dedicated attention. It suggests physicians who understood that not every ailment needed to be dramatic or life-threatening to deserve a genuine, documented remedy. Some forms of suffering are small enough to be nearly invisible in the sweep of history, and yet someone, thousands of years ago, still thought them worth writing down. Physicians recorded in the Edwin Smith Papyrus appear to have used a structured system of prognosis, sorting cases into roughly 3 categories of outlook. Some conditions were marked as favorable, meaning the physician expected to treat and successfully resolve them. Others were marked as uncertain, cases the physician would contend with, attempting treatment despite real doubt about the outcome. And some were marked so severe that no treatment was recorded at all, an honest acknowledgement that medicine of the time had reached its limit. This three-tiered structure closely resembles the basic logic behind modern medical triage, sorting patients not by panic, but by a clear-eyed assessment of what intervention could realistically achieve. It is a remarkable thing to recognize in a document this old. A mind organizing suffering not by fear, but by careful, honest probability. Egyptian physicians appear to have recognized a genuine connection between injuries to the head and paralysis elsewhere in the body. Several case studies in the Edwin Smith papyrus describe patients with skull trauma who also experienced weakness or paralysis in limbs on the opposite side of the body from the injury, an observation that aligns strikingly well with what modern neuroscience now understands about how the brain controls movement. Arriving at this connection required careful, repeated observation across many patients, linking a wound in one location to a very different kind of failure somewhere else entirely. This is not guesswork. It is early clinical neurology, built centuries before anyone possessed even the faintest understanding of nerves or neural pathways. Some of the most important discoveries in the history of medicine began not in a laboratory, but simply in a healer's willingness to notice a pattern and trust it. The very word for brain first appears in written human history within the pages of the Edwin Smith papyrus. Before this document, no known written language anywhere in the world had recorded a term specifically identifying this organ, even though the brain had of course always been part of every human body ever examined. Its appearance here, in the context of practical, injury-based case studies rather than philosophy or religion, suggests physicians encountering the organ directly, through real wounds, and needing language precise enough to describe what they were seeing. There is something profound in locating the very first written word for something so central to human identity, tucked quietly into a scroll focused not on grand theory, but on the plain, immediate business of treating the injured. Somewhere in that ancient text lies the exact moment humanity first found language for the organ that would, one day, be understood as the seat of language itself. The same remarkable document describes the surface of the brain in language that closely resembles a modern anatomical detail, its wrinkled folds compared to ripples on the surface of metal. This description refers to what we now call the brain's convolutions, the folded ridges and grooves that increase its surface area within the confines of the skull. Recognizing and describing this texture required a physician to actually observe exposed brain tissue directly, likely following severe head trauma, and to find language capable of conveying what they saw to others who had not witnessed it themselves. It is a small but extraordinary detail, evidence of real, direct anatomical observation rather than assumption or theory. Imagine a physician kneeling over a grievously wounded patient, finding within that terrible moment the presence of mind to notice, and later record the delicate rippled texture of an exposed human brain. Even in crisis, careful observation persisted, and it is that observation which still reaches us today. Following certain head injuries, ancient physicians described a clear fluid escaping from the wound, an early and largely accurate observation of cerebrospinal fluid. This fluid, which surrounds and cushions the brain and spinal cord, is not something ancient physicians could have understood in terms of its true biological function. Yet its presence following serious trauma was noted carefully enough to be recorded as a meaningful clinical sign. Recognizing that something beyond simple blood could emerge from a head wound, and considering it significant enough to document, represents a level of careful physical observation well ahead of its era. It reflects a medical tradition willing to record precisely what was seen, even when its full meaning remained entirely mysterious. Some truths can be observed accurately long before they can be explained, patiently waiting in the written record for a future mind equipped to finally understand them. At the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the skilled workers who built the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, archaeologists have discovered detailed records of workers taking sick leave. These administrative documents note when a laborer was absent due to illness, sometimes specifying the nature of the complaint, from stomach trouble to injury to what appear to be eye conditions, and even occasions of caring for a sick family member. This is an extraordinarily rare kind of evidence, a direct, bureaucratic record of ordinary health and illness among working people, rather than physicians, royalty, or religious texts. It humanizes ancient Egyptian medicine in a way few other sources manage, showing not grand theory but simple, familiar reality. A tired worker unable to report for duty because their body, like any body, sometimes failed them. Even the mightiest monuments of ancient Egypt were built, quietly and unglamorously, around the ordinary rhythms of human sickness and repose. Right. Paleopathologists studying Egyptian mummies have identified skeletal evidence consistent with tuberculosis, including the distinctive spinal deformity now known as Pott's disease. This condition occurs when tuberculosis infects the bones of the spine, causing gradual collapse and a visible curving of the back, a signature so distinct that it can still be recognized in bone thousands of years after death. Its presence confirms that this disease, which continues to affect millions of people around the world today, has been part of the human story in Egypt for a very long time indeed. Examining these ancient cases has even helped modern researchers better understand the disease's evolution and history, treating mummified remains as a kind of biological archive. It is a strange, sobering continuity, a disease still fought in modern hospitals, leaving its exact, recognizable signature on a spine curved gently within a coffin for over 3,000 years. A carved stone stela from ancient Egypt appears to depict a priest with a visibly withered, shortened leg, an image many researchers believe may represent one of the earliest recorded cases of polio. The figure, shown leaning on a staff with a leg noticeably thinner and shorter than the other, matches a pattern of muscle wasting consistent with paralytic poliomyelitis, a viral disease that damages nerve cells controlling movement. While the image alone cannot serve as definitive medical proof, its consistency with the disease's known effects has made it a frequently cited piece of evidence in the broader history of polio, a disease that would not be understood in any real scientific sense for thousands of years afterward. It is a haunting thing to consider. One man's altered body, carved carefully in stone by someone who loved or respected him, quietly carrying forward evidence of a disease into a future none of them could have imagined. Stone, once again, remembers what flesh alone could never have preserved. The mummified remains of the pharaoh, Ramesses V, show a pattern of raised skin lesions that some researchers believe may represent one of the earliest physical examples of smallpox. The distinctive, pustular marks visible on the preserved skin closely resemble the scarring left behind by smallpox infection, though the diagnosis remains debated among scholars given the challenges of confirming ancient viral disease through appearance alone. If accurate, it would place evidence of this devastating disease, one that would go on to kill hundreds of millions of people across human history, directly onto the body of a king who ruled more than 3,000 years ago. It is a strange and heavy thought, an emperor's preserved body possibly carrying, silently across all those centuries, one of the earliest physical traces of a sickness that would go on to shape and end so many other lives long after his own. Even preserved for eternity, a body can still whisper forward warnings the living have not yet finished learning to hear. Ancient Egyptian surgeons used strands of sinew and linen thread to close wounds, an early and genuinely functional form of suturing. Careful stitching held torn skin together, encouraging faster, cleaner healing than a wound left simply bandaged and hoped for. Evidence of this technique appears both in surviving medical texts and in the physical examination of certain mummified remains, where old wounds show signs of having been deliberately closed rather than left to heal on their own. This required real manual skill, steady hands working with simple tools to achieve something that remains, in principle, essentially unchanged in modern surgical practice today. It is easy to forget how enormous a leap this represents. The realization that a wound's edges, drawn back together and held firmly in place, will heal far better than one left open to the world. Some of the most important surgical insights in human history required no advanced technology at all, only patience, care, and a steady thread. Physicians in ancient Egypt used heated metal instruments to cauterize wounds, sealing tissue through controlled, deliberate burning. This technique served two purposes at once: stopping active bleeding by sealing damaged blood vessels, and reducing the risk of infection by destroying compromised tissue before it could spread further harm through the body. Cauterization would have been an agonizing procedure for the patient. Yet in cases of severe bleeding, it likely meant the difference between life and death, a harsh but genuinely effective intervention within the medical tools available at the time. Its use reflects a physician's willingness to cause immediate, controlled pain in service of a greater, longer-term survival, a difficult calculation that healers have quietly made across every era of human history. Fire, so often associated purely with destruction, became in careful hands a tool of healing instead, wielded with precision rather than fury. Snake bites and scorpion stings, an ever-present danger throughout the Egyptian landscape, received their own dedicated body of practical medical treatment. Beyond the ritual protection offered by Circuit's priesthood, physicians developed genuine physical treatments for envenomation, including specific plant-based remedies and wound care, aimed at reducing swelling and drawing out venom from the site of the bite. Given how frequently laborers, farmers, and travelers would have encountered venomous creatures in the desert and along the riverbanks, this represents a body of knowledge built directly out of harsh, repeated necessity. Physicians treating these cases needed to work quickly, under real pressure, refining their responses through outcomes that were often measured starkly in survival or death. It is sobering to imagine how many trials, how much loss, went into slowly refining a treatment that might save the next victim brought in gasping and swollen from a scorpion sting. Egyptian physicians appear to have examined the color, clarity, and consistency of a patient's urine and stool as part of their diagnostic process. This practice, sometimes called uroscopy in later medical traditions, involved observing bodily fluids for signs that might indicate the nature or severity of an illness, an approach that would be picked up and expanded significantly by later Greek and medieval physicians. While the underlying science was limited by the standards of any modern laboratory, the basic instinct that the body's outputs can reveal what is happening within it remains a genuinely valid diagnostic principle still used today in different form. It shows physicians paying close attention to every available clue the body offered, unwilling to rely on guesswork alone when observable evidence was right in front of them. Some of medicine's oldest habits of careful looking have never really gone out of style, only grown more precise with time. Skeletal remains recovered from ancient Egyptian burial sites occasionally show skull fractures that healed cleanly, evidence of both surgical intervention and genuine patient survival. These healed injuries indicate that some patients received effective treatment following severe head trauma, whether through careful cleaning, stabilization, or in certain cases the trepanation procedures described earlier, and lived on afterward for a meaningful length of time. Such findings challenge any assumption that serious head injury in the ancient world was reliably fatal, revealing instead a medical tradition capable of managing even some of the body's most delicate and dangerous wounds. Each healed fracture represents an individual human story now lost to us in every detail except this one enduring fact, that they were badly hurt, and they did not die from it. Bone, in its own quiet and patient way, keeps a kind of record that even memory itself cannot. Egyptian physicians, known as SW&W, sometimes accompanied military campaigns, treating soldiers wounded in battle far from home. Historical records and artistic depictions suggest that army units traveled with medical personnel prepared to manage traumatic injuries, a role that would have demanded rapid, practical treatment under far more chaotic and urgent conditions than the calm of a temple or a settled household. Wounds from arrows, blades, and blunt weapons required exactly the kind of trauma expertise reflected in texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, suggesting a real and direct link between battlefield necessity and the development of Egyptian surgical knowledge. Military medicine, in other words, is not a modern invention, but an ancient and continuous thread, refined through the harsh, urgent circumstances of war across every age of human conflict. Somewhere on a forgotten battlefield, a physician once knelt beside a wounded soldier and made, in an instant, the very same kind of life-or-death decision still made in field hospitals today. Ancient Egyptian remedies for hair loss reveal a medical culture willing to address even the gentlest, most cosmetic of human worries. Recipes preserved in medical papyri call for mixtures of animal fats, sometimes combined with specific plant extracts, applied directly to the scalp in hopes of restoring thinning hair. There is no strong evidence that these particular treatments were effective by modern standards, yet their presence in serious medical texts, alongside remedies for far graver conditions, tells us something meaningful about the full breadth of what ancient physicians were expected to address. Vanity, it seems, is not a modern invention, and neither is medicine's willingness to take it seriously. Picture a nobleman seated patiently while a physician works a fragrant, greasy paste into his scalp, hoping for a result no different from what people quietly hope for in pharmacies today. Some human worries, it turns out, have simply never changed at all. Egyptian medical tea. XDS include recipes explicitly intended to smooth wrinkles and restore a more youthful appearance to aging skin. One preparation recorded in the Ebers Papyrus is described in language suggesting it could transform an old man into a young one, a bold claim wrapped around a practical mixture of plant and mineral ingredients meant to be applied topically. While the promise was almost certainly exaggerated, the underlying desire it reflects feels entirely familiar, a very human wish to soften the visible marks that time leaves behind. This blending of cosmetic ambition and medical seriousness shows a society that saw no real separation between healing the body and caring for how that body appeared to the world. It is oddly comforting to imagine an ancient scribe carefully copying out an anti-aging recipe, fully aware, perhaps, that it promised more than it could deliver. Some hopes are simply timeless, however they happen to be dressed. Some mummified remains show teeth that were deliberately perforated, likely as a method for draining painful dental abscesses. Rather than simply extracting a badly infected tooth, evidence suggests that in certain cases a small hole was carefully drilled through the tooth itself, allowing trapped infection and pressure to escape and easing what would otherwise have been agonizing pain. This represents a surprisingly precise and conservative dental intervention, preserving the tooth rather than removing it outright. A philosophy not unlike some modern root canal procedures performed for very similar reasons. Achieving this without modern drills, anesthesia, or any understanding of bacterial infection required real steadiness of hand and a genuine willingness to work with extraordinary care so close to a suffering patient's nerve endings. It is a quiet, startling reminder that gentleness and precision have always been possible, even with the crudest of tools, whenever a healer cared enough to attempt them. Ancient Egyptian medical texts describe early contraceptive methods, some of which contained ingredients now understood to have genuine spermicidal properties. Certain recipes called for a paste made partly from acacia gum, which ferments to produce lactic acid, a compound still used today in some modern spermicidal formulations for its ability to impair sperm motility. This particular remedy, recorded thousands of years before anyone understood reproductive biology in any real detail, appears to have been arrived at purely through observed effectiveness, passed down and refined across generations of practical use. It stands as one of the more startling examples of ancient medicine accidentally brushing up against genuine modern pharmacology, its underlying chemistry working correctly for reasons no one at the time could have possibly explained. Sometimes the oldest solutions to deeply personal, private problems turn out to be quietly, remarkably sound, waiting patiently across the centuries for science to finally catch up and explain why. Gynecological treatment in ancient Egypt sometimes included a practice known as vaginal fumigation, in which medicinal smoke or vapor was directed toward the body as a form of internal treatment. Recorded in several medical papyri, this method involved burning specific substances and allowing the resulting smoke to reach the patient in a controlled, deliberate way, intended to address issues ranging from menstrual complaints to fertility concerns. While the underlying theory bears little resemblance to modern gynecological understanding, the practice reflects a serious, sustained medical interest in women's reproductive health, treated as a legitimate and important area of care, rather than something overlooked or dismissed. It required specific preparation, specialized substances, and presumably a physician experienced enough to judge dosage and duration carefully. Even in a civilization so distant from our own, women's health was treated as something worth genuine, deliberate medical attention, not left to chance or silence. Midwives, sometimes remembered simply as wise women within their communities, played an essential and largely unrecorded role in ancient Egyptian childbirth. While formal medical papyri focus heavily on remedies and named physicians, the actual physical process of delivering a child would most often have been guided by experienced women passing practical knowledge directly from one generation to the next, likely without ever being formally titled or credited in surviving texts. This gap in the written record does not mean their expertise was any less real or vital, only that history, as it so often does, failed to preserve the names of those whose knowledge lived primarily in hands and memory rather than ink and papyrus. Every successful birth in ancient Egypt, of which there were countless thousands across the centuries, likely depended on this quiet, uncredited expertise far more directly than on any scroll. Some of High Story's most essential knowledge was never written down at all, carried instead entirely within the steady, practiced hands of women whose names time simply did not think to keep. Small curved objects carved from hippopotamus ivory, often called birth tusks, were used as protective, almost talismanic tools during Egyptian childbirth. Decorated with images of protective animals and deities, these curved ivory pieces were likely used in rituals meant to ward off danger during labor, perhaps traced symbolically around the birthing space to create a kind of protective boundary against harmful forces. Archaeologists have recovered numerous examples, many worn smooth from repeated handling, suggesting they were treasured, carefully kept objects passed down or reused across multiple births within a household or community. Their existence highlights just how dangerous and uncertain childbirth truly was in the ancient world, dangerous enough to warrant not just medical and herbal preparation, but layers of ritual protection as well. Picture a smooth curved tusk, carved with tiny protective animals, held tightly in a trembling hand during the most uncertain hours of a woman's life. Fear, it seems, has always inspired its own quiet forms of careful craftsmanship. Obsidian, a naturally occurring volcanic glass, was prized by Egyptian surgeons for blades capable of an edge sharper than most metal instruments of the time. When fractured correctly, obsidian can produce a cutting edge only a few molecules thick, sharper in practical terms than many modern surgical steel blades, a property that would have made it exceptionally valuable for delicate incisions, requiring precision and minimal tissue damage. Its use in Egyptian surgical contexts suggests physicians who actively sought out the most effective available material for their instruments, rather than settling passively for whatever happened to be on hand. This willingness to source specialized material from outside Egypt's borders reflects a surprisingly sophisticated approach to surgical practice, treating the sharpness and reliability of a blade as something worth real effort to obtain. It is a striking thought that some of the sharpest cutting edges available anywhere in the ancient world were being pressed carefully into human skin not out of violence, but in careful service of healing. At certain temples dedicated to Imhotep, the deified physician, patients would sleep within the sacred grounds hoping to receive healing guidance through their dreams. This practice, known as temple incubation, involved a patient traveling to the temple, undergoing purification rituals, and then lying down to sleep in a designated space, trusting that Imhotep himself might appear during the night to diagnose their condition or reveal the proper remedy. Priests would often interpret the dreams reported upon waking, translating them into practical treatment recommendations for the patient to follow. In a very real sense, this represents medicine and sleep intertwined at their deepest possible level. Healing sought not through waking effort alone, but through surrender, rest, and whatever wisdom the unconscious mind might offer once the body was finally still. There is something quietly beautiful in imagining an entire tradition built around the idea that real healing might begin only once a person allowed themselves, fully and trustingly, to fall asleep. The pharaoh Ramesses II is recorded as having sent an Egyptian physician abroad to attend to the ailing king of the Hittites, a rival and later allied empire. Diplomatic correspondence surviving from this period reveals requests passed between royal courts for medical expertise, treating skilled physicians almost as valuable diplomatic assets, worth lending across political and even hostile borders in service of a fellow ruler's health. This tells us that Egyptian medical knowledge was not only respected within its own borders, but actively sought after by foreign powers, considered advanced enough to be worth the enormous logistical effort of sending a trained healer across a significant distance. It also reveals something quietly human beneath the grand politics of empire, that even rival kings, when illness came for them, reached out to one another for help rather than standing entirely apart. Sickness, it seems, has always had a way of briefly softening even the hardest political boundaries between nations. Some ancient Egyptian physicians held remarkably specific titles, including one identified simply as physician of the eyes of the palace. Inscriptions naming individual court physicians reveal a level of specialization extending even into the royal household itself, with certain healers dedicated specifically to the pharaoh's ocular health alone, distinct from physicians responsible for other parts of the royal body. This reflects not only medical specialization, but also the immense value placed on the health of the rule. Are important enough to warrant dedicated, narrowly focused expertise, rather than the more generalized care available to ordinary citizens. It offers a small, human glimpse into palace life, a specific person whose entire professional identity centered around the well-being of a single pair of royal eyes. Even absolute power, wrapped in gold and myth, still depended quietly on the steady, careful attention of one trained person doing one very specific job well. Egyptian physicians appear to have recognized certain antimicrobial properties in copper, using it in some medical and hygienic applications. Copper vessels were sometimes used for storing or treating water, and some evidence suggests copper compounds were incorporated into wound treatments as well, a practice that modern science has since confirmed does carry genuine antibacterial benefit, since copper ions are capable of disrupting the cell walls of many harmful microorganisms. Arriving at this insight without any concept of microbes required exactly the kind of patient, repeated observation that defines so much of ancient Egyptian medicine. Noticing simply that water or wounds treated this way seemed to fare better than those that were not. It is a small, quiet thread connecting an ancient metal, still valued today in modern antimicrobial coatings and surfaces, back to careful hands testing its properties along the banks of the Nile thousands of years earlier. Some elements of the natural world, it seems, have been offering us the same quiet help for as long as anyone has thought to look closely enough to notice. Garlic appears repeatedly across Egyptian medical texts as a specific remedy for toothache and dental infection. Beyond its broader reputation for strength and general health, garlic's genuinely antimicrobial compounds would have offered real, if limited, relief for the painful bacterial infections so common given the region's notoriously abrasive, grit-filled bread. A suffering patient might have a clove pressed directly against an aching tooth or gum, a simple remedy grounded in real chemistry, even though the underlying science remained centuries away from being understood. This small, humble kitchen plant appears again and again throughout Egyptian medicine, valued not for any single grand application, but for its broad, quietly dependable usefulness across an enormous range of common ailments. It is worth pausing on how often the most ordinary ingredients turn out, on closer modern inspection, to have been doing real and measurable work all along. Paleopathologists studying ancient Egyptian remains have discovered calcified evidence of guinea worm infection, a parasitic disease still fought in parts of the world today. This affliction, caused by a long, thread-like parasite that migrates beneath the skin before painfully emerging, typically after contact with contaminated water, leaves distinctive traces that can still be identified in preserved tissue thousands of years later. Its presence in ancient Egyptian remains confirms that this particular disease, one that international health efforts have worked for decades to nearly eliminate entirely in the modern era, has burdened human communities along waterways for an extraordinarily long span of time. Finding it preserved in ancient tissue allows researchers to trace the disease's history and spread with far greater precision than written records alone could ever offer. It is a strange kind of continuity, one of the very last diseases modern medicine hopes to eliminate entirely, still leaving its ancient signature quietly preserved in bodies prepared for eternity so long ago. Genetic testing, performed on the mummy of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, revealed evidence of multiple malaria infections during his lifetime. Researchers extracting and analyzing ancient DNA from his remains identified genetic material belonging to the parasite responsible for malaria, suggesting the young king suffered repeated bouts of the disease, potentially contributing to the frail health hinted at by other skeletal evidence found throughout his body. This finding, made possible only through modern genetic sequencing technology applied to remains thousands of years old, offers a startlingly intimate window into the actual lived health struggles of one of history's most famous rulers. It reframes the boy king not as a distant, golden myth, but as a genuinely unwell young person, quietly battling an ancient and persistent disease that still threatens millions of people around the world today. Even golden masks and eternal monuments, it turns out, could never fully protect a fragile human body from the oldest and most patient of diseases. Evidence of gallstones and kidney stones has been identified within the preserved organs and remains of certain Egyptian mummies. These painful mineral formations, which still affect people around the world today, leave behind distinct physical traces that researchers have been able to identify even after thousands of years of preservation, confirming that this particular form of suffering long predates any aspect of modern diet or lifestyle, sometimes blamed for causing it. Ancient physicians had no way of understanding what these stones were or why they formed, yet patients experiencing their effects would certainly have sought relief through whatever remedies were available at the time, however limited their true effectiveness. It is a quietly humbling thought that a specific, sharp kind of pain still keenly familiar to patients in modern hospitals was already being endured without explanation by people living and suffering along the Nile so many thousands of years ago. Ancient Egyptian art appears to depict individuals with dwarfism holding respected and often prestigious social positions, rather than being marginalized or hidden away. A well-documented example is Seneb, a court official whose tomb depicts him seated proudly alongside his family, indicating a life of genuine status, wealth, and evident familial affection rather than exclusion. Individuals with dwarfism are also shown serving in respected roles connected to jewelry making, entertainment, and religious or funerary practice, suggesting a society that, at least in some contexts, valued their presence and contribution rather than treating physical difference as something to be hidden. This offers a rare and genuinely touching glimpse into how a very different physical body might be integrated with dignity into a functioning ancient society. It is worth remembering gently that inclusion and respect are not purely modern inventions, but ideas that different civilizations have found their own ways toward across the whole long span of human history. The Greek poet Homer, writing centuries after Egypt's medical golden age had already passed, still described Egyptian physicians as possessing knowledge surpassing that of any other people. In the Odyssey, Homer refers to Egypt as a fertile land producing an abundance of medicinal herbs, and specifically praises its physicians as more skilled in the healing arts than any others found throughout the known world of his time. This reputation, preserved not in a medical text, but in one of the most enduring works of literature in human history, tells us how far and how deeply Egyptian medical prestige had traveled beyond its own borders, carried forward through story and legend long after the specific techniques themselves had likely evolved or faded. It is a remarkable thing to have a civilization's medical reputation immortalized not through the dry language of scholarship, but through epic poetry recited and cherished for thousands of years afterward. Sometimes, a culture's greatest achievements survive best not in the records they kept themselves, but in the admiration quietly recorded by others. The historian Herodotus went so far as to describe Egypt as the healthiest of all lands, crediting its favorable and remarkably stable climate. Writing in the 5th century BCE, he suggested that Egypt's consistent weather patterns, unlike the more erratic conditions he associated with other regions, contributed to a population that experienced fewer sudden shifts in health tied to changing seasons. While this particular explanation reflects the medical theories of his own time rather than genuine modern epidemiology, his broader observation that Egyptian society appeared unusually organized and attentive around matters of health echoes consistently across multiple ancient sources describing the region. It suggests that Egypt's reputation for medical sophistication was not an isolated claim, but a broadly shared impression among outside observers who had genuinely traveled and witnessed its practices firsthand. Reputation, once earned carefully enough across generations, has a way of traveling on its own, carried forward by visitors eager to describe what impressed them most. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus praised the highly organized, almost legally codified structure underlying Egyptian medical practice. He described a system in which physicians were expected to follow established, written treatments passed down through generations, and were held blameless if a patient died despite properly following this traditional guidance, but could face serious consequences if they deviated from accepted practice, and the outcome proved fatal. This represents a strikingly early example of standardized medical protocol, treating consistency and accountability as central values within the profession itself, rather than leaving treatment entirely to each individual physician's personal judgment. It suggests a system deeply concerned not just with healing individual patients, but with maintaining trust and consistency across the medical profession as a whole. Long before anything resembling modern medical licensing existed, Egypt had already built a framework asking a strikingly similar question: how do we hold healers accountable while still allowing them room to heal? The great center of learning at Alexandria, founded generations after Egypt's most ancient medical texts were first written, became a direct beneficiary of this long-standing tradition of careful anatomical inquiry. Physicians such as Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in this later Egyptian city under Greek rule, are credited with conducting some of the earliest systematic human dissections in the ancient world, building meaningfully upon centuries of prior Egyptian familiarity with the human body, developed originally through mummification and practical medical treatment. Alexandria's famous library and its associated centers of study drew scholars from across the ancient Mediterranean, creating fertile ground for genuinely new anatomical discoveries to take root in soil that had, in a sense, already been carefully prepared centuries earlier. It represents a beautiful continuity, ancient embalmers working quietly in service of religious ritual, laying an unintentional foundation that later scholars, working in service of pure inquiry, would eventually build upon in ways the original practitioners could never have imagined. Knowledge, it turns out, rarely begins entirely new. It grows, layer upon patient layer, out of everything that came quietly before it. Egyptian medical knowledge appears to have meaningfully influenced the later Greek medical tradition associated with Hippocrates. Scholars have long noted striking similarities between certain remedies, diagnostic approaches, and even specific case study structures found in Greek medical writings, and those recorded far earlier in Egyptian papyri, such as the Edwin Smith and Ebers texts. Ancient tradition itself held that prominent Greek thinkers and physicians traveled to Egypt specifically to study under its priests and healers, absorbing centuries of accumulated medical wisdom before returning home to shape what would eventually become the foundation of Western medicine. Whether through direct instruction, translated texts, or the slow diffusion of ideas along trade and travel routes, the through line connecting Egyptian and Greek medicine appears too consistent to be pure coincidence. It is a quietly profound thought that so much of what we now consider the origin point of Western medicine may itself simply be one particularly well-remembered chapter in a much older story that actually began far earlier, beside a different river entirely. Egyptian prescriptions were often measured using precise, standardized units, reflecting a surprisingly careful and quantitative approach to dosing remedies. Units such as the hin, roughly equivalent to a specific standardized volume, appear repeatedly throughout medical papyri, specifying exact quantities of specific ingredients rather than vague or casual measurements. This level of precision suggests physicians who understood, at least practically, that the amount of a substance given to a patient genuinely mattered, that more was not simply always better, and that consistency in dosing likely produced more reliable and repeatable results across different patients and treatments. It reflects an underlying scientific instinct, careful measurement in service of predictable outcomes, that feels remarkably continuous with the exacting precision demanded of pharmacists and physicians today. Even thousands of years ago, someone understood that healing sometimes depends less on which ingredient is chosen and more on exactly how much of it is carefully measured out. Certain Egyptian remedies included specific instructions that an accompanying spell be recited a precise number of times, often four, for the treatment to take full effect. This attention to exact repetition reflects deep-seated numerological beliefs woven throughout Egyptian religious and medical thought, in which certain numbers were considered to carry inherent power or significance beyond their simple mathematical value. A remedy was not considered complete with the correct ingredients alone. It required the correct words, spoken the correct number of times, with the correct intention, all working together as a single unified treatment. This reflects, once again, just how fully integrated physical and spiritual healing truly were within Egyptian medicine, refusing any clean separation between the measurable and the mystical. It is a strangely beautiful thought, a physician counting quietly under their breath, trusting that the simple act of repetition itself carried real, tangible healing power, alongside whatever herbs rested in their other hand. Taken together, the full body of surviving Egyptian medical texts represents one of the largest and most detailed collections of ancient medical knowledge anywhere in the world. Spanning papyri focused on trauma, internal medicine, gynecology, dentistry, veterinary care, and pharmacology, this collective body of work reveals a civilization that took the systematic study and treatment of illness extraordinarily seriously, dedicating enormous resources of time, training, and careful record-keeping toward the singular goal of easing human suffering. No other ancient civilization has left behind quite so complete and varied a written record of its medical thinking, making Egypt an unusually clear window into how early humans first began to organize their understanding of the body into something resembling genuine, structured knowledge. It is worth sitting quietly with the scale of this achievement. Entire libraries of careful observation, accumulated patiently across centuries, all in service of something as universal and as deeply human as the desire to heal and to be healed. Ancient tradition holds that several prominent Greek thinkers, including the philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, traveled specifically to Egypt to study under its priests and physicians before returning home with what they had learned. While the full details of these journeys are difficult to verify with certainty this many centuries later, the consistency with which ancient Greek sources describe Egypt as a destination for serious scholarly study, rather than merely a curiosity to be visited, suggests a widely shared respect for the depth and seriousness of Egyptian medical and philosophical knowledge. Physicians and scholars alike appear to have believed that something genuinely worth learning existed there, significant enough to justify a long and difficult journey away from home. It reflects a world in which knowledge, even now, tends to pool wherever it has been most carefully tended and preserved, drawing serious minds toward it almost as if by quiet gravity. Long before universities or formal academic exchange existed in any recognizable form, curious minds were already crossing borders and seas, simply to sit at the feet of those who knew more than they did. Even the ordinary discomfort of scalp irritation and lice received specific, documented attention within Egyptian medical practice. Remedies describe treatments meant to soothe itching and eliminate these persistent parasites, a problem common enough in daily life that it warranted its own place among more serious medical concerns recorded in surviving papyri. Given how closely lice infestation was tied to hygiene and comfort, and how thoroughly Egyptians valued personal cleanliness as both a religious and practical matter, it is unsurprising that even this small, itching nuisance received real medical consideration rather than simple neglect. It is a small, almost tender detail, in some ways more relatable than any grand surgical procedure. A physician taking seriously a complaint so ordinary that it might otherwise be lost entirely to the sweep of history. Even the smallest discomforts of daily life, it seems, were never considered too minor for genuine medical attention. Egyptian physicians appear to have carefully cataloged the body's internal channels, with some texts listing a specific total number of vessels believed to run throughout the body. The Ebers Papyrus describes a system of 46 distinct vessels connecting to the heart, carrying not only blood, but also air, tears, and other bodily fluids to their appropriate destinations throughout the body. While this framework does not map precisely onto the modern circulatory and nervous systems as we understand them today, the sheer act of attempting a specific, numbered anatomical catalog reveals an impulse toward precision and thoroughness that feels remarkably scientific in spirit, even where its specific conclusions fell short. It suggests physicians who wanted not just a general theory of the body, but an exact, countable map of its inner workings, something that could be taught, memorized, and passed down with real specificity. Even an incomplete map, drawn with this much careful intention, still represents a genuine act of dedicated scientific ambition. Surviving remains show evidence of rib fractures that healed cleanly, suggesting ancient Egyptians received effective care even for injuries to the fragile, constantly moving structure of the chest. Because the ribs flex continuously with every single breath, fractures in this area are notoriously difficult to immobilize completely, making successful healing without modern imaging or surgical stabilization a genuinely impressive medical outcome. Physicians likely relied on careful binding, rest, and close observation, trusting the body's own healing process, while doing what they could to minimize further movement and pain during recovery. Each well-healed rib found in ancient remains represents weeks or months of careful, patient management, a slow partnership between physician and patient working quietly together toward recovery. It is a gentle reminder that healing, even now, so often depends less on dramatic intervention and more on patient, careful attention sustained fully over time. Egyptian physicians distinguished between different types of fever using specific descriptive language, suggesting real attention to the varied ways illness could present itself in the body. Rather than treating all elevated body heat as a single, undifferentiated symptom, medical texts describe fevers accompanied by different secondary signs, guiding physicians toward different corresponding treatments depending on the fuller pattern of symptoms observed. This reflects a genuinely clinical mindset, an understanding that the same broad symptom could signal very different underlying conditions, each deserving its own careful, distinct response, rather than a single universal remedy applied indiscriminately. Arriving at these distinctions required exactly the kind of patient, comparative observation across many different patients that underlies real medical progress in any era. It is easy to assume ancient medicine treated illness as one simple, uniform enemy, and yet here again we find real nuance, real attention to the small differences that actually matter most in careful diagnosis. A surviving papyrus known today as the Dream Book records interpretations of dreams, many of which were believed to carry meaningful signs about a person's health and future well-being. Compiled by priests and consulted by ordinary people hoping to understand the meaning behind their own nighttime visions, this text treated dreams not as random mental noise, but as genuine messages worth careful, deliberate interpretation, sometimes carrying warnings about illness or reassurance about recovery. This sits naturally alongside the broader Egyptian belief that sleep itself held real diagnostic and even healing power, echoed clearly in the temple practice of dream incubation discussed earlier in tonight's journey. It suggests an entire culture that viewed the unconscious hours of rest not as empty, wasted time, but as a meaningful, active part of a person's ongoing health and inner life. There is something quietly fitting in ending our own journey here, with an ancient civilization that believed something important could still be happening, gently, even while the body was fully, peacefully asleep. Egyptian physicians also documented remedies for burns, a common and painful hazard in a world lit by open flame and cooked over exposed fire. Fresh burns were often treated with a combination of cooling substances and honey, applied directly to the injured skin, a treatment that modern research has shown genuinely supports wound healing by keeping the area moist while limiting bacterial growth. Some remedies also called for specific plant preparations believed to soothe pain and encourage the skin to recover without excessive scarring, applied and reapplied carefully over the course of days. Burns were an unavoidable part of daily life in a civilization that cooked over open flame, worked with hot tools, and lit its nights with oil lamps, making effective treatment a genuinely important and frequently needed skill. It is a small, practical kindness to imagine a careful hand applying something cool and soothing to an injury as old and as universal as fire itself. Priests serving Sekhmet, the lioness goddess associated with both plague and healing, are believed to have performed practical surgical duties as part of their broader religious responsibilities. Rather than functioning purely as ritual specialists focused only on prayer and incantation, evidence suggests these priests took on genuine hands-on medical work, particularly in treating wounds and trauma, blending sacred duty with practical, physical skill in a single unified role. This dual identity, part priest and part surgeon, reflects once again how thoroughly Egyptian society resisted separating the spiritual from the practical, trusting the same individual to hold both responsibilities at once with equal seriousness. It suggests a demanding role, requiring not only religious training and ritual knowledge but real anatomical skill, and a steady hand capable of genuine surgical work when the moment required it. Some of history's most capable healers, it seems, wore the vestments of religion and the practical skill of a surgeon at exactly the same time, refusing to choose between the two. Egyptian medical papyri occasionally include remedies described as having been personally tested and approved by the physician recording them, a small but meaningful marker of genuine clinical confidence. Certain treatments carry notes affirming that the remedy has been proven effective through direct use, distinguishing it from other recipes offered more tentatively or drawn simply from older tradition without personal verification. This distinction matters. It shows physicians actively evaluating their own practice, willing to note when something had earned their trust through real, observed results rather than simply repeating inherited knowledge without question. It suggests an evolving, living body of medical practice, quietly refined generation after generation by real physicians paying close attention to what actually worked in front of them. Even thousands of years ago, someone understood the simple, enduring difference between a remedy merely inherited and one that had truly, personally earned its place in a trusted physician's hands. Physicians also documented remedies aimed specifically at easing the discomfort of digestive troubles, from bloating and cramping to more serious intestinal complaints. Plant-based preparations, often combined with careful dietary adjustment, were recommended depending on the specific nature of the complaint, reflecting an understanding that digestive illness could take many different forms, each deserving its own tailored response rather than a single blanket treatment. Given how heavily the Egyptian diet relied on bread and beer, both products of fermentation and grinding processes that could easily introduce irritation or infection, digestive complaints were likely a near constant presence in daily medical practice. Physicians appear to have approached these common, unglamorous complaints with the same careful attention given to far more dramatic injuries and conditions. It is easy to imagine grand surgery and sacred temples when picturing ancient Egyptian medicine. And yet so much of a physician's actual daily work would have looked exactly like this: quiet, ordinary, and endlessly necessary. Even the simple act of applying a cool cloth or a gentle poultice to a feverish patient appears throughout Egyptian medical practice, a small, unglamorous kindness offered again and again across countless bedsides. No elaborate ritual accompanied every treatment. No grand incantation was always required. Sometimes the entire remedy was simply comfort itself, offered patiently by someone willing to sit close, to watch carefully, and to ease suffering however modestly they could in the moment. It is worth remembering that most of ancient Egyptian medicine, for all its papyri and named physicians and carved temple reliefs, ultimately unfolded in exactly this quiet, ordinary way, one tired, worried caregiver attending gently to one uncomfortable patient at a time. That simple, unrecorded gentleness may be the truest and most enduring medicine of all, then and now. And so we come to the end of our journey through the medicine of ancient Egypt. We began beside Imhotep, a physician so beloved he became a god, and traveled through the careful, clinical pages of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, where the very word for brain first entered written human language. We lingered over honey pressed into open wounds, over moldy bread offered instinctively against infection thousands of years before anyone understood what penicillin was. We considered a small wooden toe, carved and adjusted with real care so that one woman might simply walk more comfortably through her days. And we sat for a while with Peseshet, the earliest named woman physician history remembers, wondering quietly about all the other women whose names were never carved into anything that survived. We walked among birth bricks at Abydos, protective ivory tusks worn smooth by trembling hands, and the quiet, uncredited wisdom of midwives whose knowledge lived only in memory and touch. We heard of workers at Deir el-Medina taking sick leave for stomach trouble and sore eyes, so wonderfully, achingly human across the distance of 3,000 years. And we ended among scholars in Alexandria, building carefully upon a foundation that Egyptian hands had been quietly laying for centuries before them. Let all of that settle now gently into stillness. There is nothing left to understand tonight, nothing left to remember, nothing left to do at all except rest. Let your breathing continue to slow, soft, and even, each exhale a little heavier than the one before it. Let your body sink further into wherever it is resting, fully supported, fully safe. You are a part of this long, unbroken story of hands reaching quietly toward healing, of humans caring for other humans across every single age that has ever existed, including this one, including you, right now, cared for simply by the act of resting. If you enjoyed this gentle journey, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. If you're still awake, another video may already be waiting quietly on your screen. But if not, that is more than all right. Sleep well and good night.